Blitzkrieg is a method of warfare whereby an attacking force, spearheaded by a dense concentration of armored and motorized or mechanized infantry formations with close air support, breaks through the opponent's line of defense by short, fast, powerful attacks and then dislocates the defenders, using speed and surprise to encircle them with the help of air superiority. Through the employment of combined arms in maneuver warfare, Blitzkrieg attempts to unbalance the enemy by making it difficult for it to respond to the continuously changing front, then defeat it in a decisive Vernichtungsschlacht, battle of annihilation. During the interwar period, aircraft and tank technologies matured and were combined with systematic application of the traditional German tactic of Bewegungskrieg, maneuver warfare, deep penetrations, and the bypassing of enemy strong points to encircle and destroy enemy forces in a Kesselschlacht, cauldron battle. During the invasion of Poland, Western journalists adopted the term Blitzkrieg to describe this form of armored warfare. The term had appeared in 1935, in a German military periodical Deutsche Wehr, German Defense, in connection to quick or lightning warfare. German maneuver operations were successful in the campaigns of 1939 to 1941, and by 1940 the term Blitzkrieg was extensively used in Western media. Blitzkrieg operations capitalized on surprise penetrations, e.g., the penetration of the Ardennes forest region, general enemy unreadiness and their inability to match the pace of the German attack. During the Battle of France, the French made attempts to reform defensive lines along rivers but were frustrated when German forces arrived first and pressed on. Despite being common in German and English language journalism during World War II, the word Blitzkrieg was never used by the Wehrmacht as an official military term, except for propaganda. Some senior officers, including Kurt Student, Franz Halder, and Johann Adolf von Kielmansegg, even disputed the idea that it was a military concept. Kielmansegg asserted that what many regarded as Blitzkrieg was nothing more than ad hoc solutions that simply popped out of the prevailing situation. Student described it as ideas that naturally emerged from the existing circumstances as a response to operational challenges. The Wehrmacht never officially adopted it as a concept or doctrine. In 2005, the historian Karl-Heinz Frieser summarized Blitzkrieg as the result of German commanders using the latest technology in the most beneficial way according to traditional military principles and employing the right units in the right place at the right time. Modern historians now understand Blitzkrieg as the combination of the traditional German military principles, methods, and doctrines of the 19th century with the military technology of the interwar period. Modern historians use the term casually as a generic description for the style of maneuver warfare practiced by Germany during the early part of World War II, rather than as an explanation. According to Frieser, in the context of the thinking of Heinz Guderian on mobile combined arms formations, Blitzkrieg can be used as a synonym for modern maneuver warfare on the operational level. Definition. Common interpretation. The traditional meaning of Blitzkrieg is that of German tactical and operational methodology in the first half of the Second World War, that is often hailed as a new method of warfare. The word, meaning lightning war or lightning attack in its strategic sense, describes a series of quick and decisive short battles to deliver a knockout blow to an enemy state before it could fully mobilize. Tactically, Blitzkrieg is a coordinated military effort by tanks, motorized infantry, artillery, and aircraft, to create an overwhelming local superiority in combat power, to defeat the opponent and break through its defenses. Blitzkrieg as used by Germany had considerable psychological, or terror elements, such as the Jericho trumpet, a noise-making siren on the Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber, to affect the morale of enemy forces. The devices were largely removed when the enemy became used to the noise after the Battle of France in 1940, and instead bombs sometimes had whistles attached. It is also common for historians and writers to include psychological warfare by using fifth columnists to spread rumors and lies among the civilian population in the theater of operations. Origin of the term. The origin of the term Blitzkrieg is obscure. It was never used in the title of a military doctrine or handbook of the German Army or Air Force, and no coherent doctrine or unifying concept of Blitzkrieg existed. The term seems rarely to have been used in the German military press before 1939, and recent research at the German Militärgeschichtliches Forschungsamt at Potsdam found it in only 2 military articles from the 1930s. Both used the term to mean a swift strategic knockout, rather than a radical new military doctrine or approach to war. The first article, 1935, deals primarily with supplies of food and materiel in wartime. The term Blitzkrieg is used with reference to German efforts to win a quick victory in the First World War, but is not associated with the use of armored, mechanized, or air forces. It argued that Germany must develop self-sufficiency in food, because it might again prove impossible to deal a swift knockout to its enemies, leading to a long war. In the second article, 1938, launching a swift strategic knockout is described as an attractive idea for Germany but difficult to achieve on land under modern conditions, especially against systems of fortification like the Maginot Line, unless an exceptionally high degree of surprise could be achieved. The author vaguely suggests that a massive strategic air attack might hold out better prospects, but the topic is not explored in detail. A third relatively early use of the term in German occurs in Die Deutsche Kriegsstark, German War Strength, by Fritz Sternberg, a Jewish, Marxist, political economist and refugee from the Third Reich, published in 1938 in Paris and in London as Germany and a Lightning War. Sternberg wrote that Germany was not prepared economically for a long war but might win a quick war, Blitzkrieg. He did not go into detail about tactics or suggest that the German armed forces had evolved a radically new operational method. His book offers scant clues as to how German lightning victories might be won. In English and other languages, the term had been used since the 1920s. The British press used it to describe the German successes in Poland in September 1939, called by Harris a piece of journalistic sensationalism, a buzzword with which to label the spectacular early successes of the Germans in the Second World War. It was later applied to the bombing of Britain, particularly London, hence the Blitz. The German popular press followed suit 9 months later, after the fall of France in 1940, hence although the word had been used in German, it was first popularized by British journalism. Heinz Guderian referred to it as a word coined by the Allies. As a result of the successes of our rapid campaigns, our enemies coined the word Blitzkrieg. After the German failure in the Soviet Union in 1941, use of the term began to be frowned upon in the Third Reich, and Hitler then denied ever using the term, saying in a speech in November 1941, "I have never used the word Blitzkrieg, because it is a very silly word." In early January 1942, Hitler dismissed it as Italian phraseology. Military evolution, 1919 to 1939. Germany. In 1914, German strategic thinking derived from the writings of Karl von Clausewitz, June 1, 1780 to November 16, 1831, Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, October 26, 1800 to April 24, 1891, and Alfred von Schlieffen, February 28, 1833 to January 4, 1913, who advocated maneuver, mass, and envelopment to create the conditions for a decisive battle, Vernichtungsschlacht. During the war, generals such as Oskar von Hutier developed tactics to restore maneuver on the battlefield. Specialist light infantry, Sturmtruppen stormtroops, were to exploit soft spots, to make gaps for larger infantry units to advance with heavier weapons and exploit the success, leaving isolated strong points to troops following up. Hutier tactics were combined with short hurricane artillery bombardments using massed artillery, devised by Colonel George Bruckmüller. Attacks were to rely on speed and surprise rather than on weight of numbers. Hutier-Bruckmüller tactics met with great success in Operation Michael, the spring offensive of 1918, and restored temporarily the war of movement, once the Allied trench system had been overrun. The German armies pushed on towards Amiens and then Paris, coming within 120 kilometers, 75 miles, before supply difficulties and Allied reinforcements halted the advance. On the Eastern Front, the war did not bog down into trench warfare. German and Russian armies fought a war of maneuver over thousands of miles, which gave the German leadership unique experience which the trench-bound Western Allies did not experience. Studies of operations in the East led to the conclusion that small and coordinated forces possessed more combat power than large, uncoordinated forces. After the war, the Reichswehr modified Ussr tactics. The commander-in-chief, Hans von Seeckt, argued that there had been an excessive focus on encirclement and emphasized speed instead. Seeckt inspired a revision of Bewegungskrieg, maneuver warfare, thinking and its associated Auftragstaktik, in which the commander gave his intent and subordinates the discretion to achieve it, within limits determined by the training of an elite officer corps, which made their decisions predictable to other commanders. Delegation increased the tempo of operations, which had great influence on the success of German armies in the early war period. Seeckt rejected the idea of numerical superiority and developed the German army into a small, mobile force and encouraged technical advances, of which one of the results was enhancing the radio use, which allowed better coordination between motorized infantry, tanks, and planes and thus provided the necessary conditions for the subsequent Blitzkrieg. He thus transformed it into an army of commanders, who could cover at least the next level of command. German operational theories were revised after the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles limited the Reichswehr to a maximum of 100,000 men, making impossible the deployment of mass armies. The German General Staff was abolished by the treaty but continued covertly as the Truppenamt, troop office, disguised as an administrative body. Committees of veteran staff officers were formed within the Truppenamt to evaluate 57 issues of the war. By the time of the Second World War, their reports had led to doctrinal and training publications, including HDV 487, Führung Gefechter verbundenen Waffen, Command and Battle of the Combined Arms, known as Das Fug, 1921-23, and Truppenführung, 1933-34, containing standard procedures for combined arms warfare. The Reichswehr was influenced by its analysis of pre-war German military thought, in particular infiltration tactics, which at the end of the war had seen some breakthroughs on the Western Front and the maneuver warfare which dominated the Eastern Front. Britain. The British Army took lessons from the successful infantry and artillery offensives on the Western Front in late 1918. To obtain the best cooperation between all arms, emphasis was placed on detailed planning, rigid control, and adherence to orders. Mechanization of the army was considered a means to avoid mass casualties and indecisive nature of offensives, as part of a combined arms theory of war. The 4 editions of Field Service Regulations published after 1918 held that only combined arms operations could create enough firepower to enable mobility on a battlefield. This theory of war also emphasized consolidation, recommending caution against overconfidence and ruthless exploitation. In the Sinai and Palestine campaign, operations involved some aspects of what would later be called Blitzkrieg. Key elements in the Blitzkrieg warfare at the decisive Battle of Megiddo included concentration, surprise, and speed. Success depended on attacking only in terrain favoring the movement of large formations around the battlefield and tactical improvements in the British artillery and infantry attack. General Edmund Allenby used infantry to attack the strong Ottoman front line in cooperation with supporting artillery, augmented by the guns of 2 destroyers. Through constant pressure by infantry and cavalry, 2 Ottoman armies in the Judean hills were kept off balance and virtually encircled during the battles of Sharon and Nablus, Battle of Megiddo. The British methods induced strategic paralysis among the Ottomans and led to their rapid and complete collapse. In an advance of 65 miles, 105 kilometers, captures were estimated at least 25,000 prisoners and 260 guns. Liddell Hart considered that important aspects of the operation were the extent to which Ottoman commanders were denied intelligence on the British preparations for the attack through British air superiority and air attacks on their headquarters and telephone exchanges, which paralyzed attempts to react to the rapidly deteriorating situation. France. French doctrine in the interwar years was defense-oriented. Colonel Charles de Gaulle was an advocate of concentration of armor and aeroplanes. His opinions were expressed in his book Vers l'armée de métier, Towards the Professional Army 1933. Like von Seeckt, he concluded that France could no longer maintain the huge armies of conscripts and reservists with which World War I had been fought, and he sought to use tanks, mechanized forces, and aircraft to allow a smaller number of highly trained soldiers to have greater impact in battle. His views little endeared him to the French High Command but are claimed by some to have influenced Heinz Guderian. Russia/USSR. In 1916, General Alexei Brusilov had used surprise and infiltration tactics during the Brusilov offensive. Later, Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, Georgy Iserson, and other members of the Red Army developed a concept of deep battle from the experience of the Polish-Soviet War. These concepts would guide Red Army doctrine throughout World War II. Realizing the limitations of infantry and cavalry, Tukhachevsky was an advocate of mechanized formations and the large-scale industrialization required. Robert Watt, 2008, wrote that Blitzkrieg holds little in common with Soviet deep battle. In 2002, H.P. Wilmot had noted that deep battle contained two important differences: it was a doctrine of total war, not limited operations, and decisive battle was rejected in favor of several large, simultaneous offensives. The Reichswehr and the Red Army began a secret collaboration in the Soviet Union to evade the Treaty of Versailles occupational agent, the Inter-Allied Commission. In 1926, war games and tests were begun at Kazan and Lipetsk. The centers were used to field test aircraft and armored vehicles up to the battalion level and housed aerial and armored warfare schools, through which officers were rotated. Nazi Germany. After becoming head of government in 1933, Adolf Hitler ignored the Versailles Treaty provisions. A command for armored forces was created within the German Wehrmacht, the Panzerwaffe, as it came to be known later. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was established, and development began on ground attack aircraft and doctrines. Hitler was a strong supporter of this new strategy. He read Guderian's book Achtung, Panzer. And upon observing armored field exercises at Kummersdorf he remarked, "That is what I want, and that is what I will have." Guderian. Guderian summarized combined arms tactics as the way to get the mobile and motorized armored divisions to work together and support each other to achieve decisive success. In his book, Panzer Leader, he wrote, "In this year, 1929, I became convinced that tanks working on their own or in conjunction with infantry could never achieve decisive importance. My historical studies, the exercises carried out in England and our own experience with mock UPS had persuaded me that the tanks would never be able to produce their full effect until the other weapons on whose support they must inevitably rely were brought up to their standard of speed and of cross-country performance. In such formation of all arms, the tanks must play primary role, the other weapons being subordinated to the requirements of the armor. It would be wrong to include tanks in infantry divisions. What was needed were armored divisions which would include all the supporting arms needed to allow the tanks to fight with full effect." Guderian believed that developments in technology were required to support the theory, especially, equipping armored divisions tanks foremost, with wireless communications. Guderian insisted in 1933 to the High Command that every tank in the German armored force must be equipped with a radio. At the start of the war, only the German army was thus prepared with all tanks radio-equipped. This proved critical in early tank battles where German tank commanders exploited the organizational advantage over the Allies that radio communication gave them. Later all Allied armies would copy this innovation. During the Polish campaign, the performance of armored troops, under the influence of Guderian's ideas, won over a number of skeptics who had initially expressed doubt about armored warfare, such as von Rundstedt and Rommel. According to David A. Grossman, by the 12th Battle of Isenzo, while conducting a light infantry operation, Rommel had perfected his maneuver warfare principles, which were the very same ones that were applied during the Blitzkrieg against France in 1940, and repeated by the Allied grounded offensive against Iraq in the 1991 Gulf War, During the Battle of France, Hitler caused a confusion when he suddenly changed his ideas and ordered that everything should be completed in a few weeks. His original plan would have taken years to be completed, encouraging Rommel and Guderian to disobey their direct superiors' orders by forging ahead and, on the way, invented the idea of Blitzkrieg. It was Rommel who created the first archetype of Blitzkrieg, leading his division far ahead of flanking divisions. MacGregor and Williamson remarked that Rommel's version of Blitzkrieg displayed a significantly better understanding of combined arms warfare than that of Guderian. General Hoth submitted an official report which declared that Rommel had explored new paths in the command of panzer divisions. Methods of operations. Schwerpunkt. Schwerpunktprinzip was a heuristic device, conceptual tool or thinking formula, used in the German army since the 19th century, to make decisions from tactics to strategy about priority. Schwerpunkt has been translated as center of gravity, crucial, focal point and point of main effort. None of these forms is sufficient to describe the universal importance of the term and the concept of Schwerpunktprinzip. Every unit in the army, from the company to the supreme command, decided on a Schwerpunkt through Schwerpunktbildung, as did the support services, which meant that commanders always knew what was most important and why. The German army was trained to support the Schwerpunkt, even when risks had to be taken elsewhere to support the point of main effort. Through Schwerpunktbildung, the German army could achieve superiority at the Schwerpunkt, whether attacking or defending, to turn local success at the Schwerpunkt into the progressive disorganization of the opposing force, creating more opportunities to exploit this advantage, even if numerically and strategically inferior in general. In the 1930s, Guderian summarized this as Klotzen, nicht kleckern. Kick, don't spatter them. Pursuit. Having achieved a breakthrough of the enemy's line, units comprising the Schwerpunkt were not supposed to become decisively engaged with enemy front line units to the right and left of the breakthrough area. Units pouring through the hole were to drive upon set objectives behind the enemy front line. In World War II, German panzer forces used motorized mobility, to paralyze the opponent's ability to react. Fast-moving mobile forces seized the initiative, exploited weaknesses, and acted before opposing forces could respond. Central to this was the decision cycle, tempo. Decision-making required time to gather information, make a decision, give orders to subordinates to implement the decision. Through superior mobility and faster decision-making cycles, mobile forces could act quicker than the forces opposing them. Directive control was a fast and flexible method of command. Rather than receiving an explicit order, a commander would be told of his superior's intent and the role which his unit was to fill in this concept. The method of execution was then a matter for the discretion of the subordinate commander. Staff burden was reduced at the top and spread among tiers of command with knowledge about their situation. Delegation and the encouragement of initiative aided implementation. Important decisions could be taken quickly and communicated verbally or with brief written orders. German soldiers also used Provitin, a form of amphetamine, which was given to drivers, to keep them awake. Mopping up. The last part of an offensive operation was the destruction of unsubdued pockets of resistance, which had been enveloped earlier and bypassed by the fast-moving armored and motorized spearheads. The Kesselschlacht Cauldron battle was a concentric attack on such pockets. It was here that most losses were inflicted upon the enemy, primarily through the mass capture of prisoners and weapons. During Operation Barbarossa, huge encirclements in 1941 produced nearly 3.5 million Soviet prisoners, along with masses of equipment. Air power. Close air support was provided in the form of the dive bomber and medium bomber. They would support the focal point of attack from the air. German successes are closely related to the extent to which the German Luftwaffe was able to control the air war in early campaigns in Western and Central Europe, and the Soviet Union. However, the Luftwaffe was a broadly based force with no constricting central doctrine, other than its resources should be used generally to support national strategy. It was flexible and it was able to carry out both operational tactical, and strategic bombing. Flexibility was the Luftwaffe's strength in 1939 to 1941. Paradoxically, from that period onward it became its weakness. While Allied air forces were tied to the support of the army, the Luftwaffe deployed its resources in a more general, operational way. It switched from air superiority missions, to medium-range interdiction, to strategic strikes, to close support duties depending on the need of the ground forces. In fact, far from it being a specialist panzer spearhead arm, fewer than 15% of the Luftwaffe was intended for close support of the army in 1939. Limitations and countermeasures. Environment. The concepts associated with the term Blitzkrieg, deep penetrations by armor, large encirclements, and combined arms attacks were largely dependent upon terrain and weather conditions. Where the ability for rapid movement across tank country was not possible, armored penetrations were often avoided or resulted in failure. Terrain would ideally be flat, firm, unobstructed by natural barriers or fortifications, and interspersed with roads and railways. If it were instead hilly, wooded, marshy, or urban, armor would be vulnerable to infantry in close quarters combat and unable to break out at full speed. Additionally, units could be halted by mud, thawing along the eastern front regularly slowed both sides, or extreme snow. Armor, motorized and aerial support was also naturally dependent on weather. It should however be noted that the disadvantages of such terrain could be nullified if surprise was achieved over the enemy by an attack through such terrain. During the Battle of France, the German Blitzkrieg-style attack on France went through the Ardennes. There is little doubt that the hilly, heavily wooded Ardennes could have been relatively easily defended by the Allies, even against the bulk of the German armored units. However, precisely because the French thought the Ardennes unsuitable for massive troop movement, particularly for tanks, they were left with only light defenses which were quickly overrun by the Wehrmacht. The Germans quickly advanced through the forest, knocking down the trees the French thought would impede this tactic. Air superiority. The influence of air forces over forces on the ground changed significantly over the course of the Second World War. Early German successes were conducted when Allied aircraft could not make a significant impact on the battlefield. In May 1940, there was near parity in numbers of aircraft between the Luftwaffe and the Allies, but the Luftwaffe had been developed to support Germany's ground forces, had liaison officers with the mobile formations, and operated a higher number of sorties per aircraft. In addition, German air parity or superiority allowed the unencumbered movement of ground forces, their unhindered assembly into concentrated attack formations, aerial reconnaissance, aerial resupply of fast-moving formations and close air support at the point of attack. The Allied air forces had no close air support aircraft, training, or doctrine. The Allies flew 434 French and 160 British sorties a day, but methods of attacking ground targets had yet to be developed, therefore Allied aircraft caused negligible damage. Against these 600 sorties the Luftwaffe on average flew 1,500 sorties a day. On May 13, Flieger Corps 8 flew 1,000 sorties in support of the crossing of the Meuse. The following day the Allies made repeated attempts to destroy the German pontoon bridges, but German fighter aircraft, ground fire, and Luftwaffe flak batteries with the panzer forces destroyed 56% of the attacking Allied aircraft while the bridges remained intact. Allied air superiority became a significant hindrance to German operations during the later years of the war. By June 1944 the Western Allies had complete control of the air over the battlefield and their fighter-bomber aircraft were very effective at attacking ground forces. On D-Day the Allies flew 14,500 sorties over the battlefield area alone, not including sorties flown over northwestern Europe. Against this on June 6 the Luftwaffe flew some 300 sorties. Though German fighter presence over Normandy increased over the next days and weeks, it never approached the numbers the Allies commanded. Fighter-bomber attacks on German formations made movement during daylight almost impossible. Subsequently, shortages soon developed in food, fuel, and ammunition, severely hampering the German defenders. German vehicle crews and even flak units experienced great difficulty moving during daylight. Indeed, the final German offensive operation in the west, Operation Wacht am Rhein, was planned to take place during poor weather to minimize interference by Allied aircraft. Under these conditions it was difficult for German commanders to employ the armored idea, if at all. Counter tactics. Blitzkrieg is vulnerable to an enemy that is robust enough to weather the shock of the attack and that does not panic at the idea of enemy formations in its rear area. This is especially true if the attacking formation lacks the reserve to keep funneling forces into the spearhead, or lacks the mobility to provide infantry, artillery, and supplies into the attack. If the defender can hold the shoulders of the breach, they will have the opportunity to counterattack into the flank of the attacker, potentially cutting off the van as happened to Kampfgruppe Peiper in the Ardennes. During the Battle of France in 1940, the 4th Armored Division, Major General Charles de Gaulle, and elements of the 1st Army Tank Brigade, British Expeditionary Force, made probing attacks on the German flank, pushing into the rear of the advancing armored columns at times. This may have been a reason for Hitler to call a halt to the German advance. Those attacks combined with Maxime Weygand's hedgehog tactic would become the major basis for responding to blitzkrieg attacks in the future. Deployment in depth, permitting enemy or shoulders of a penetration was essential to channeling the enemy attack, and artillery, properly employed at the shoulders, could take a heavy toll of attackers. While Allied forces in 1940 lacked the experience to successfully develop these strategies, resulting in France's capitulation with heavy losses, they characterized later Allied operations. At the Battle of Kursk, the Red Army employed a combination of defense in great depth, extensive minefields, and tenacious defense of breakthrough shoulders. In this way they depleted German combat power even as German forces advanced. The reverse can be seen in the Russian summer offensive of 1944, Operation Bagration, which resulted in the destruction of Army Group Center. German attempts to weather the storm and fight out of encirclements failed due to the Russian ability to continue to feed armored units into the attack, maintaining the mobility and strength of the offensive, arriving in force deep in the rear areas, faster than the Germans could regroup. Logistics. Although effective in Chu.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.